Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Alpha BI podcast. Today's topic of discussion is pivot. Pivot is the most under-observed and underrated aspect of running and building a startup, and I feel like not enough discussion has been made on it. So today we are picking up on that topic, and to start out the discussion with Malav, the first topic I'd choose is recognizing the startup pivot. So, Malav, could you tell me the difference between general startup struggles and a genuine need to change something fundamental?
Okay, so I think general struggles gets improved. Like, I mean, they improve with, small iterations that we do every day. Small improvements, small tweaks can show us improvements. While if you are talking about pivoting signals, these are the problems that persist even after big changes and, multiple iterations. You cannot solve them that easily. You just keep seeing them. That's I think the main difference between those two. And I mean, if we talk about examples, then your customer acquisition cost is continuously high. Your unit economics don't improve at scale. You cannot scale. You need to change your business model sometime. You see your customers talking about other problems than the core problem that you are solving. That's also a signal. So I think that's the difference.
What are the most common red flags that you observe across startups that require a fundamental change?
So I mean, from talking from the sales point of view, we see that customers are very enthusiastic in the sales meeting. Like they want the product from tomorrow. But once the meeting is over, you take follow-ups. There's no real, getting back to it. That's one of the red flags I would consider. Then there's also other point where you get your early customers, but they do not convert into advocates of your product. They do not give you referrals. Your NPS score is low. Those are also a few of the red flags.
But what if there is still organic growth in your sales? Does that should that still require a pivot? Or
I mean, then you are doing good, but when you will need to pivot is when the organic growth gets plateaued and you need to update your marketing message. There's also a small pivot we could consider.
Okay. So if there is any sort of the graph stops escalating, like
Exactly. So that's what we call the customer segment pivot, where you need to find new customers. Maybe the segment of customers you are focusing on are not relating to your product. They are not giving you real traction, or they are getting plateaued. You need to bring in new customers. That's also a pivot.
Okay. So next, let's talk about type of pivots that you commonly observe. So what are the type of pivots, and would it be possible for you to rate them difficulty-wise?
Okay. I mean, the first one is we've already talked about the customer segment pivot. That's one thing. Then we talk about problem pivot, where the problem you are solving is not the biggest problem of your customer, so you need to focus on other problems. Then we also talk about something called solution pivot, where the problem is there, but the solution that you are giving to your customers is not really solving their problem. Then you change your solution. There's also technical pivoting, where your technical architecture is not working at scale. You need to shift. I don't know if we should consider that in technical debt. I think you might answer that better, but that's also a pivot. Then there's business model pivots, where your pricing is not working for your customers. You're either very expensive, either very cheap. Your unit economics are not improving. So I mean, these are some types of pivots that usually happen. And if I come to a difficulty question, I think not everything is very difficult, but sometimes what happens is different types of problems gets overlapped. So you need to work on multiple pivots combined. That sometimes get difficult.
Like you could definitely categorize pivots based on your experience, but it is still very difficult to recognize when you are in the moment doing your startup.
Exactly.
Because you might not have the actual numbers.
So pivots usually come out of blue. You don't know what you're going to do tomorrow.
Yeah. So yeah, that brings me to my next topic, which is data-driven decision making. So what metrics do you think should a startup have in order to make pivotal decisions?
Yeah. So very similar to the types of pivots that we talked about just now. First of all is acquisition metrics. where's your customer acquisition cost, what are your conversion rates. Then you talk about engagement metrics, how people are using your product, how engaged they are, is it solving their problem or not. That's also something. Then you need to look at your financial metrics. What, as I said, unit economics. Are you profitable? Is it possible to become profitable at your current financial metrics? That's also something to consider. And customer feedback. I mean, your NPS score is the best metric, I would say. Are your customers your advocate? Are they bringing in new referrals or not?
And I think this is where some of the startups they make mistake because they are very interested in vanity metrics, like
Exactly.
things that look very good but do
Hmm.
not really affect their business, and they start looking into those metrics and they make really critical mistakes when it.
I know, yeah.
Yeah,
Quite accurate.
right. So yeah, and talking about like customer feedback for your metrics and your decision making. So how much customer feedback do you think is enough to justify a pivot?
Here, I don't think I talk quantitatively, but I talk qualitatively, I think. Um, so, what happens is, when we talk about normal business struggles, you solve them, you get improvement, right? But when we talk about pivot signals, you recognize patterns that you need to solve, right? So, first of all, when you are getting customer feedback, look out for those patterns.
Mm.
If it's something, if a pattern is consistent and it's making a problem, mm, you don't need anything more. I would say, and if you're talking quantitatively, if you're taking customer surveys and everything, I would say if 50 to 60% of your customers are giving you a pattern, then there's a problem. And I
Right.
think also you need to focus on your customer segment when you talk about those samples, because you need to clearly ask a particular customer segment those questions. You cannot talk to scattered bunch of people and
Right.
bring out justifications after that.
Mm.
That's never gonna happen.
But I don't think that sort of statistic would anyway result into a
Exactly.
consensus.
But what happens is sometimes founders take those kind of data and make decisions out of it.
Right.
That creates larger problem that what's existing.
True. Okay, so moving forward, let's discuss about resource management and timing. Do you think there is a way to identify the right time to pivot?
I mean, there is, and it's very simple. If you find out those patterns, if you have problems, you need to pivot,
Mm.
right? But there's a problem of too early and too late. Too early is if you have just started your startup or you have just changed your direction of or taken a pivot, and it's just been 2-3 months. You cannot make another pivoting decision because you do not have enough data to act upon, is what I believe. And if we talk about too late, um, you have data, but you don't have enough runway to survive on a pivot, right?
Mm.
That's when it's too late. Let's say if you have 3 or 4 months of runway in your bank account and you want to pivot, you won't be able to get enough data about the decision
Right.
that you have made.
Mm.
Rather, just keep that money, settle it with your investors,
Right.
right? But if you have, I would say the golden point for me would be if you have around 8 to 12 months of runway in your bank account, that would be great. Then you would be able to do it better.
Right. And I think with pivot, like people are often concerned with their ongoing momentum.
Mm.
Do you think there is an efficient way of reallocating stuff, adjusting your ongoing operations to maintain the continuous momentum?
Yes, I mean, if you are already doing something and it's not too bad, but you need a pivot, I think you should start with a MVP. And by MVP, I don't mean a minimum viable product, but a minimum viable pivot, uh, which means you separate out a small chunk of your team for the next direction or the new direction that you're
Mm.
working upon, and try everything with that team with a small customer, group, so that you can validate your new direction. You won't waste a lot of resources,
Right.
you know, pivoting. Then I would say you can also phase your transition. If you are not completely renovating your business or completely, the whole business model is changing or something, you can do it phase wise. Do it for a small chunk of customers, then for some,
Mm.
and eventually, transforming. And you also have to, I think, uh, think about your existing contracts with your customers. You might have some commitments already been made,
Right.
right? You also have to honor those, and investors also. You might have made commitments to investors also. You also have to take care of those.
Consider all of this. There are certain assets that you
Hmm.
definitely cannot pivot almost immediately. So, what do you think are the most important resources that you should carefully pivot when you are considering a pivot?
Uh, I think team knowledge and capabilities is something I would want to talk about first, because when you are pivoting, you also need to, impart that into your team, and your team has also given a lot of time to your old business or whatever you've been doing, right? So I think that needs to be carried upon, and your pivot should not be, you know, such that those capabilities and that data gets, that becomes useless, that's not going to work for
Hmm.
you. Then there's customer relationships. I mean, if you could use your existing relationships into your next product or your next pivot or your next direction, I think that would be great. You can get a jump start, at the starting. You could use that. Brand equity, or your brand
Right.
overall in the market, is also something you should take care of while pivoting.
So earlier you talked about your runway,
Hmm.
but before you actually pivot. But what if it is made a situation for a founder? There is no runway, and everything is at the edge of the cliff. So how do you then make a pivot, or how do you make pivotal decisions at that point?
Right. So you don't have a runway.
Yeah, you
Okay.
don't have runway.
Then you will need funds first of all, right?
Yeah.
To get that, you will have to impart your vision and your decisions to your investors first, and you have to be very radically honest with your investors, right? You have to show them why are you taking this decision. You need to show them the data that you have, gathered and read. uh, so I think that would solve your funds problem.
Yeah, makes sense definitely because you will need some sort of money to run your company at the end of the day.
Exactly.
And but so let's say we are considering a bootstrap startup, which they're just running out of their own pocket. Should they? So MVP would come into play at that point, right? So they would make
Yeah.
smaller pivots and eventually
Hmm.
move into a
Yeah,
bigger
but it still
direction.
depends on the risk appetite that's left for the founders.
Hmm.
I mean, if there's nothing on the plate, then you won't be able to do that.
Right, makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about stakeholder management.
Hmm.
So let's say you have decided you want to pivot, you have the funds for a pivot. How do you communicate your pivotal decisions to your investors, your team members, your co-founders?
I mean, as I said, you need to show them the data and the patterns that you have noticed and upon which you have made the decisions that you have made. And you have to be completely transparent about it. You cannot be opaque with them, right, about all these things, because they are into the business as much as you are,
Hmm.
right? And I think you should, when you're talking about pivots, you should put your pivot as a evolution rather than failure,
Hmm.
because you don't want your stakeholders to lose faith in you,
Right,
right? Because if they do, you're nothing, right?
right.
So yeah, they need to understand what you're doing, why you are doing, and you need to impart that vision into them.
So I think like not everyone would listen about like hear out a pivot and uh, you know have confidence in the whole situation.
Hmm.
So because it is naturally impacted that like naturally implying that something is not really
Of
working.
course.
So but how do you still maintain confidence with your stakeholders?
I mean, you have to acknowledge what they are feeling, right?
Mm.
You talk to them, you understand why they are feeling what they are feeling, and try to, answer. And I think what's very important is during the phase of pivoting, you need to make the communication gaps as least as possible. You
Mm.
need to, uh, decrease the size of your communication loop. If you are meeting certain teams of your business once a week, you need to do that 3 days,
Right.
every 3 days. I think that would, speed up the adoption rate.
Right. Makes sense. But let's say there are still some people who are you completely against your idea, have no confidence in you whatsoever. So how do you handle those sort of stakeholders?
talk to them again, I would say first, right? Understand what they are feeling and separate, list out all the disagreements that they have, separate all of them into facts and interpretation,
Mm.
because not everything is factual, right? When it comes to humans, um, if you can do that, if you can convince them out of this, then set good deadlines and timelines about what you are giving to them, you know. But I mean, I would be completely honest over here because we are in the business world and we are not playing a game, right? Sometimes some people would be left behind after a pivot, because
Yeah.
some people would have come to your company for the vision that you started working on. Now you are not. If they don't feel like they are the right fit for the company, you might have to let them go. And I think you have to be completely honest about that.
Right. So it sort of makes me feel that there is a strong psychological aspect
Yeah, of course.
involved when it comes to pivot, and
Mm.
it's in general when it comes to running your own startup. So, what are the common psychological challenges that you seen when founders typically consider pivots?
I mean, one thing that we have talked in the previous episodes also, and a lot of times, is the identity attachment. Founders get very much attached to the initial vision and the idea that they've started working on. I mean, you have to, be brave about it. And, you need the courage to, step ahead of that, because it's eventually gonna stop the growth of the company. I mean, there's something called sunk cost fallacy, where, it becomes very difficult for founders to go ahead because they are very much attached to the time and the resources that they've spent previously on the business. And I mean, it's hard, but you need the courage to acknowledge your mistakes that you have made. And you can, one thing that very much happens is, the decision paralysis. Founders know they need to pivot. They know that they are doing something wrong. They know the solution also, but they cannot make the decision because, they feel I don't have enough runway. I've done so much for this. How can I leave this behind?
Right.
You need to fight with all
So
this.
there's decision paralysis as well as over analysis paralysis.
Exactly.
Right. So, what sort of a mindset shift would you suggest to a founder that makes them see this thing as an opportunity rather than a failure?
So I think you need to stop seeing your pivot as a failure, but you need to see it as a learning. So I would say, because whenever you fail or you pivot, you take a lot of learnings, even more learnings than the times you are succeeding, right? So I think that's the only thing I want to say here. I mean, just look forward.
Yeah. And it's like fighting a war every single day when you're running a startup. So
Exactly.
you need to be prepared for whatever is going to be thrown at your face and just deal with it at the
Yeah,
end of the day.
of course.
So now after all this, let's say we have made the pivot. So now there comes the time to actually validate your pivot, right? So what do you think like would be the general case? Like how fast would you start noticing, your pivotal effects? Let's call it.
So initially, there's an obvious J curve you will see, right? Once you pivot and you've completely pivoted, you will see downfalls in every metric that you measure. You have to be ready for that, right? But two things: early engagement metrics and customer responses. These are the first metrics you'll start noticing, because you're marketing your product, you put in new marketing messages, you're talking to new customers and everything. So you'll see that first, and then the obvious metric, you need to start looking at the sales conversion.
Right.
If it's a business model pivot, I'm not talking about the technical pivots right now. So sales conversion, obviously. Yeah, I mean, it's a phased approach kind of thing, right? First you will see the marketing metrics going up, then you'll see sales conversion, and I think those are the signals. But I would say 4 to 6 weeks after getting into the market,
Right.
is when you will start seeing something positive. And if you are into B2B SaaS or something, I would say it would take a little bit more time than the consumer products, but yeah, that's average time frame, I would say.
Right. So, what validation methods do you think worked like very well when it comes to testing out new directions. So how do you test out smaller effects?
So I think these are very basic. First of all, what we always talk about, building an MVP, right?
Right.
Putting an
Yes.
MVP in the market. That might be a working prototype of your product or even a landing page where you're taking feedback.
Hmm.
That's the most basic
Right.
framework you could use. Then if you have a product and if your pivot is not very big, you could start by giving your new product to a small batch of customers and taking data from there. That's also a good uh, way to approach this. And the good old concierge method, where you don't have a working product right now,
Hmm.
but you give your solution as a service to your
Right.
customers and
Right.
test out if the problem that you are solving is existing and
Hmm.
if that's creating actual value.
Right. Makes sense. So I think this was a very detailed discussion on pivots, and I hope this
And
information
very
helps.
important, I would say.
Yeah, very important for sure. So that was our conversation about pivots in startup. Let us know about your thoughts in comment section. Subscribe and like this video.